If you grew up in America, you already know the story, or at least the one that's been splashed across headlines, tangled up in old crime magazines, and polished into legend by Hollywood. John Dillinger, bank robber, outlaw, public enemy number one. But there's always that one shimmering, irresistible twist that gets people hooked. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a Robin Hood. A Depression-era hero, supposedly robbing fat cat banks and passing a little something to folks scraping by. You can just about picture the fantasy. Dillinger in his fedora, arms full of stolen cash, handing it off with a grin to a grateful mother and her barefoot kids. The rumor got repeated everywhere. Newspapers, cartoons, even the old-timers at corner bars. America's own outlaw with a secret heart of gold. Every decade adds another retelling. Dillinger stole from the rich, gave to the poor. But if you're hoping for a heartwarming scene, Dillinger ladling soup in a bread line, or tossing coins to hungry kids as he barrels by in a getaway car, get ready for disappointment. Because once you actually dig through the evidence, page by page, headline by headline, police report by police report, here's the uncomfortable truth. The Robin Hood story is almost entirely smoke. No confirmed charity, no eyewitnesses, no grateful testimonials. The myth is louder than the man ever was. So, where did this legend come from? Why did America crave a Robin Hood so badly in the first place? And what does the physical reality of Depression-era outlaw life actually look like, once you strip away every Hollywood flourish and fairy tale headline? That's what we're chasing here. By the end of this episode, you'll see exactly how the Robin Hood myth was born, why it stuck, and what John Dillinger actually did for, well, mostly to, America's poor. Spoiler, it's not what the movies promised. To understand the draw, you have to start in the early 1930s, when America was at absolute rock bottom. The Great Depression wasn't just textbook misery. It was soup lines stretching for blocks, families huddled in doorways, men pawning their wedding rings just to eat. And everywhere, banks, cold brick banks, foreclosing on homes, padlocking shops, turning neighborhoods into ghost towns overnight. If you were broke, and just about everyone was, you had two real villains, Wall Street and your local bank manager. That's the world John Dillinger walked into. By the time his name hit the front pages, he'd already done a hard stretch in prison and come out with nothing but a chip on his shoulder, a battered cloth bag, and a crash course in armed robbery. He was a small-time nobody who, almost overnight, became America's most wanted man. But here's where the legend gets sticky. Dillinger wasn't robbing banks to give back. He robbed banks because that's where the money was, and he needed it badly. Meanwhile, the press, they were starving for a story that made sense of the chaos. Americans were desperate for a hero. When Dillinger and his gang started pulling off their lightning-fast, athletic robberies, they looked nothing like the old, faceless crooks. Dillinger was young, good-looking, cocky as hell. He grinned for the cameras, joked with reporters, even tipped his hat to crowds outside the courthouse. He was, for a moment, the kind of criminal you could root for, if you squinted hard enough and ignored the bodies left behind. So the newspapers spun the legend, Robin Hood Bandit strikes again, America's outlaw hero. It was too good to bother with fact-checking. People lined up outside newsstands for the latest tale, a bank heist, maybe a sack of money left behind for a hungry family, maybe a cash-stuffed envelope slipped to a widow. But when you look for details, the trail goes cold. There are no police reports about cash handed to the poor, no heartfelt letters. Not a single period interview reads, "Dillinger saved us." What you actually find: battered dollar bills split among the gang, cheap meals in roadside diners, and plenty of money burned on stolen cars, greasy bribes, and safe houses with leaky ceilings. Meanwhile, the real poor, they weren't getting outlaw handouts. They were shivering in soup lines, fingering the last coins in their pockets, hoping the next knock on the door wasn't the bank coming to take the furniture. Most places, the only thing Dillinger left behind was panic and the growing suspicion that the only Robin Hood in town was the guy writing the headline, not the man swinging the Tommy gun. And yet, the myth got bigger. Dillinger the folk hero, Dillinger the people's bandit. The bigger the legend, the wider the gap grew between fantasy, full pockets, warm meals, and the grim reality. Empty hands, dirty faces, and an outlaw life that wasn't generous at all. Let's chase that myth a little further, because once you start digging for that classic Robin Hood moment, you notice how eager people were to invent one. Take the tabloids and their wild stories. Dillinger sneaking cash to widows, tossing coins to hungry kids on his way out of town. Every one of these tales has the same problem. No names, no dates, not a single police report, interview, or court record to hang it on. Even modern documentaries end up admitting no evidence exists for these claims. And after that, it's back to more B-roll of soup lines and exhausted kids. Real suffering, not outlaw philanthropy. Chasing after witnesses doesn't help much either. Modern specials love to float the idea. Maybe a grateful family, a former neighbor, a cop's cousin's, barber's friend. But when you check the period records, nothing. Not one real recipient, no letters to the press, no police memos about charity. The closest you get are later authors with lines like, "It is said" or "Legend has it." The cops? They were too busy tracing payroll thefts, chasing bribes, and scraping up evidence of armed robbery, not playing charity watchdogs. The only thing Dillinger reliably handed out in a bank was a note-reading gun, or, occasionally, a bruised ego. If you were a security guard who missed his leap over the counter, all right, maybe Hollywood was the last, best hope for the Robin Hood myth. And sure, if you want to see a slick Dillinger actor hurling cash from a speeding Ford to a crowd of orphans, there's always a movie that'll serve you the fairy tale. But step outside the theater, stare at the black and white reality, and it gets grim fast. The real Depression-era poor weren't lining up for outlaw charity. They were lining up for bread, shivering in ragged coats, counting the hours until the soup kitchen opened. Families camped under bridges. Kids dug through trash just to find a lump of coal. The only windfall most towns ever got from a bank robbery was flying glass and the risk of catching a stray bully. So, the reality, Dillinger's money was for Dillinger's crew. You rob a bank, you split the take, and you run, fast, filthy, and looking over your shoulder. Most of that cash vanished, paying off crooked safe house owners, bribing small-town cops, buying a week's silence in some drafty boarding house with a leaky chamber pot and bed bugs. There's no record, anywhere, of care packages left at orphanages or envelopes for the local widow. What you do find, over and over, are stories of desperation. Dillinger limping into drugstores for wound plasters, stuffing his pockets with canned beans, passing the hat for gas money around the gang, ducking out the back window when he heard a police siren wailing up the street. On a good day, maybe the gang scrounged up a hot meal. On a bad one, they gnawed cold bread, scraped the last beans from a rusted can, grimy fingers and all, half expecting every sound outside to be the law coming for them. Hygiene? Picture the smell. Fear, stale tobacco, motor oil, and whatever passed for washing up after a week sleeping in the back of a stolen Buick. So, what happened to all those sacks of gold supposedly tossed to the needy? Simple. They existed only in the ink-stained dreams of a desperate public. Reality was bullets, sweat, long miles on bad roads, and cash that disappeared as soon as it was stolen. The only real redistribution of wealth went straight from the bank's safe to a pawn shop counter, a safe house owner's pocket, or into the gas tank of a getaway car rattling out of town at midnight. But that Robin Hood legend just wouldn't die. People wanted a hero so badly, the newspapers kept the story alive, and the public kept hoping. Maybe, just maybe, this outlaw was different. Maybe he really did care. But check after check, claim after claim, the evidence is emptier than Dillinger's own pockets after a night on the run. You almost have to laugh. Stack every Robin Hood story ever written next to the real, miserable details of outlaw life, and what do you get? A pile of headlines, a stack of rumors, and a smell that'll never come out of your clothes. The public wanted a hero so badly, they built one out of newsprint and hope, while the real John Dillinger was just trying to make it through another night without getting shot, caught, or starved out by the next hard luck winter. And that's the real aftermath, the part almost everyone misses when they talk about Dillinger's so-called Robin Hood legacy. He didn't leave behind grateful families or anonymous gifts to the needy. He left a trail of empty pockets, terrified bank clerks, sweating cops, and a country desperate for hope, even if it had to be printed, not proven. In the end, the Robin Hood myth did a lot more than just shape Dillinger's reputation. It twisted how the public saw every headline, every manhunt, every body on a county slab. For some, believing in the legend was a survival strategy, a way to make sense of powerless anger. When the banks took your house, when the company store got your last dime, when the news was just hunger and layoffs, maybe you needed to believe someone out there was sticking it to the system on your behalf. The fact that Dillinger wasn't actually giving money to the poor, that detail was almost beside the point. But the consequences were real. Cops faced not just a gang, but a public hungry for a hero. Politicians had to explain why people cheered for the robber, not the law. Hollywood? They poured gasoline on it, selling tickets to the fantasy, long after Dillinger's body cooled on the sidewalk. The legend grew legs, swapped faces, and outlived the man. There's a reason John Dillinger still gets raised whenever someone wants to turn a criminal into a folk hero. Nobody likes to admit that the gritty, physical story is a lot less satisfying. If you want the most documented consequence of the Robin Hood myth, it wasn't hope, it was confusion. For every cartoon showing Dillinger with a sack of gold, there was a real family in a soup line, still waiting for the hero to show up. He never did. The myth survived because people needed it, not because it was true. In that way, Dillinger's story is the perfect example of how a legend papers over a hole so big you could drive a bullet-riddled getaway car through it. The long-term reality, Dillinger's memory is more myth than man. The people left behind, his family, his crew, his victims, even the cops got no closure, no redemption, no justice that fits the legend. Just the smell of old newsprint, a death mask behind glass, and a story America keeps telling itself about the outlaws it wishes it had. So next time you see a movie where the outlaw tips his hat and hands out cash to hungry kids, ask yourself, does the evidence back it up? Or is it just another story to help us sleep at night? For John Dillinger, the record's clear: bank robber, not benefactor. The Robin Hood of the Great Depression lived only in print, rumor, and the desperate hopes of a country hungry for a hero. If you want more American outlaw legends stripped down, myth-busted, and dragged back to earth, subscribe and stick around. Because the real stories, they're messier, meaner, and a lot more human than Hollywood ever lets on.